in Aristotle, Metaphysics Book 4, when he's asked about what happens if somebody says, I don't believe in the law of non-contradiction. He offers a kind of retorsion argument, a reductio argument, by saying that, well, if you rejected the law of non-contradiction, you would be using it to argue against it, and that would be self-refuting. Okay? This is Aristotle, all you idiot Thomists out there. He's making the type of argument that I make. We're actually in the Thomistic tradition. The Aristotelian tradition, so to speak. Now, Aristotle doesn't apply these types of arguments to God, but he's applying this argument of retorsion here to the law of non-contradiction. And we do the same type of move. We're just simply saying that actually God is more fundamental than even the law of non-contradiction. And so I'm taking that type of argument and I'm saying that let's apply that to God. If we can use a transcendental type of argument for a law of logic, why wouldn't we be able to use it for God? Anyway, that's the move that we're making here. 1006A, that's what we need right here. So this is where Aristotle, I think, is arguing, what if somebody says, I don't believe in proofs? So he's talking about it's possible, for example, for something to be and not be at the same time. Many, even of the physicists, adopt this theory, but we have just assumed it is impossible at once to be and to not be. And by this means, we have proven that this is the most certain of all principles. Some indeed demand to have a law proven. But this is because they lack education, where it shows that lack of education to not know of what we should require proof and what we should not. So Aristotle's kind of arguing that there's not going to be demonstrable proof of the law of non-contradiction or these basic principles. For it is quite impossible that everything should have a proof. If we required a proof of everything, then the process would go on into infinity. Even so, there would be no proof. If, on the other hand, there were some things of which no proof was needed, they cannot say what principle they think would be more self-evident. Even in the case of this law, law of identity, I think is what we're talking about. We cannot demonstrate the impossibility, or law of non-contradiction, one of the two. We cannot demonstrate the impossibility by refutation only if our opponent makes some statement. If he makes no statement, it is absurd to seek for an argument against a person who has no arguments of his own, insofar as he has none. For such a person is really no better than a vegetable. And I say by proof of refutation that by refutation differs from simple proof in that he who attempts to prove might seem to beg the fundamental question, whereas if discussion is provoked thus by someone else, refutation and not proof will be the result. The starting point for all such discussions is not the claim that he should state something is or is not so, because this might be supposed to be begging the question, but that he should say something significant both to himself and to another. This is essential if any argument is to follow, for otherwise such a person cannot reason either with himself or with another. And if this is granted, demonstration will be possible, for there will be something already defined. But the person responsible is not he who demonstrates, but he who acquiesces. I'm going to skip down. Thus, in the first place, it is obvious that, at any rate, it is true that the term to be or to not to be has a definite meaning, so that not everything can be so and not so. Again, if a man has a meaning, let this be two-footed animal. Okay, so, and then it's the next section, 105, 1006 B. Okay, yeah, this is it, I think. 1006. If, for instance, it might be said that man has not one meaning but several, of one of which is that the formula of a two-footed animal. There might be another formula as well. If we limited them in number, for a particular name, it would not be assigned to each for the formula. If, on the other hand, it be said that man has an infinite number of meanings, then obviously there could be no discourse. For it to have not to have one meaning is to have no meaning. So he's doing reductios here. Now it is impossible that being man should have the same meaning as not being man. That is, if man is merely predical of one subject, but has one meaning, for we not identify having one meaning with being predical of one subject, in this case, cultured, white, and man would also have one meaning. And so all things would be one, and thus he's saying that you couldn't have predication. It would be impossible for the same thing to be and to not be except by equivocation. So he's arguing here that if you were to say that words and predicates could cancel each other out, then meaning would no longer be possible. And so this is a kind of negative argument, a kind of reductio argument for the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction. So it's an internal critique, you could say, by doing this kind of a move. It's not the transcendental argument for God, but is the same type of a move, the same type of argument where we're saying that if you took this line, it would lead to absurdity. If you denied something like a first principle or a foundational law of logic, it would lead to absurdity and would make logic impossible. Therefore, the guy who argues against the laws of logic is actually assuming them to do so. This is a great point here about retorsion. How far does retorsion reach and what does it prove? Retorsion is a philosophical procedure whereby one attempts to establish a thesis by uncovering a performative inconsistency in anyone who denies it. It is as old as Aristotle, and it has been followed and used by philosophers as diverse as transcendental Thomists. Now you might think that, well, wait a minute, if you're a transcendental argument proponent, does that mean you're in line with transcendental Thomists? This just simply means that in the modern era, there have been Thomists who have actually, yes, adopted, believe it or not, transcendental arguments. And that's because, as you hear me point out all the time, transcendental argumentation is not new to Calvin. It's not new to Van Til or Bahnsen. It's a principle that goes back to Aristotle. I just read you the section of Metaphysics, Book 4 of Aristotle where it's referenced. I think it comes up in other places too. The idea, I think, is also present in some of the dialogue. Some presuppositional ideas are also present in the dialogues of Plato. And so, as this philosophical blog here is noting, it's not new. Right? John Damascus in Book 1 of the Fount of Knowledge utilizes this same idea, this same type of argument. In fact, I forgot I actually have Fount of Knowledge pulled up. And if I remember, it's the first chapter. Yeah, or it's actually, I think, here early on in chapter 3. And he's talking about what is philosophy. For those that don't know, John Damascus wrote a famous introductory text that's very Aristotelian on introducing people to the philosophical concepts that are used in theological literature. It's called the Fount of Knowledge, and he says, there are some people, who have endeavored to do away entirely with philosophy, asserting that it does not exist or that there's no such thing as knowledge or perception. We would answer them by asking, how is it you say that there's no philosophy, knowledge, or perception? Do you know or perceive that there is no knowledge, philosophy, or perception? Or is it by not knowing or perceiving it? If you perceive it, then you have knowledge and perception. But if it is by your not knowing it, then no one will believe you, because you're basically saying you have no knowledge. This is a transcendental type of argument, a reductio retorsion argument. Thus, as you can see, retorsion, as is pointed out here, is used in the Aristotelian tradition. And thus why there would be transcendental Thomists. But to be very clear here, there are not, to my knowledge, any Thomists who use the transcendental argument for God, you see. So that's the difference here. But transcendental arguments, contrary to these idiot Thomists who don't know anything, don't even know that their own tradition has people using transcendental arguments, and that it goes back to Aristotle and John Damascus, it's a form that you see here in retorsion. What John Damascus is doing right here is retorsion. It's outlined here in this well-known Catholic philosophy blog. proofs by retorsion have this form. Proposition P is such that anyone who denies it falls into the performative inconsistency. Therefore, ergo, P is true. Suppose that a person says that there are no assertions. This would be a performative inconsistency. The propositional content of the speech act is inconsistent with the performance. There are no assertions is the propositional content of you're asserting. That is the proposition. Thus, the speech act in this case is the performance. The inconsistency is not strictly logical, but strictly logical inconsistency obtains between propositions, and thus the performance as such is not a proposition, such as asserting. Performances belong to the category of events and not a proposition, and yet it is clear that there is some sort of analog inconsistency going on here, some sort of analog of contradiction. The content asserted is falsified by the action of asserting it. This is everything that we do all the time when we do the transcendental argument against people who are atheists or materialists or whatever. So, again, for the slow boys out there, I am not saying that this is the transcendental argument for God. It is a form of argument that shows that is inconsistent and contradictory to deny things that you're using. Does everybody see that? Do you see that what this guy right here, who I assume is a Catholic, I don't know what he is, blogger, Catholic philosophy blogger here, it's no different than what's being said right here in John Damascus. And that's basically the same thing that was being done and said in the Aristotle passage that we read from Metaphysics Book 4.